Hello, my name's Michael Gorley. I'm the local Heritage Education Manager for Historic England in the South West. In this session, I aim to take you through, first of all, a step-by-step guide to doing local history projects in your classroom. We'll look at various starting points for local history. We'll look at different resources that you can use for local history. But most importantly, it's hopefully to inspire you into trying this out in the classroom. So whether or not you're a history expert, I'm hoping there'll be something that you can use here practically in the classroom with your children, just to get them thinking and engaged with the local history. Even if you don't live in the area and you yourself are not sure about what the local history is here, it doesn't matter. This hopefully will help you discover it. A little bit of background on Historic England. So you may be more familiar with English heritage. So if you've ever visited Tintagel, for example, that's English heritage site. In 2015, they separated from Historic England. They are now a self-sustaining charity, much like the National Trust. Historic England, we're the government body left over. So we do things like listed buildings. So you may be familiar with some of the listed buildings near you. That's us. We do government advice on heritage, and we do education. And so the education programme that I manage is called the Heritage Schools Programme. This was set up in 2012. The key aims, as you can see on the screen, are about engaging children with their local history and giving them a sense of pride in where they're from. So I always say at this point, probably about 95% of what we do with schools is within walking distance of the school. So it's not about putting children onto a coach and taking them to visit a site. It's about what is there locally that you can access easily, and what are the local stories right outside the school. So we're going to jump straight in. We're going to start by looking at aerial photographs. Now, Historic England have a huge archive of aerial photographs. They're all kept in a big refrigerated room in Swindon. These we can create packs of these photographs and historic maps for any school in the country. They can be centred on your own school, or they could be centred on a locality near your school. And if you want to be part of the Heritage Schools programme, which is entirely free, let us know and we can create a pack like this for your school. The ones I'm going to use today, we're going to look at specifically at Red Roof, but all the ideas I'm talking about can be transferred anywhere else in Cornwall. So this first photograph, taken 12th of July 1946, is an RAF photograph immediate post-war. And they're just lots of fun to use with children. I've used these with children from as young as year ones right up to year nines, tens. When you're using these, you're not necessarily trying to identify features, first of all, with children. They don't need to know what they're looking at. What I like to do is pretty much what I do when I'm looking at a new area like Red Roof is what patterns can I see? What things are instantly recognisable? So on this one, for example, what jumped out at me were these two lines which crisscross in the middle, and that helped me orientate myself and work out which way around this should go. There are shapes like these ones of open spaces. That's one which looks to me like some kind of a roundabout, which is quite unusual in 1946. Just interesting shapes and patterns in the landscape. So now we move on to a more modern photograph. So this one is 1988, so 40 years later. And with the children, we're looking now at change and continuity through time. So I always like to start with continuity, what's familiar. So can we identify those same shapes that we saw on the previous photograph? So straight away, there are the two lines that we spotted. A couple of open spaces. This one's taken from a slightly different place, so we haven't got all the same things that we saw on the previous slide. But because we're a bit closer in, children might start identifying things on this one. So they might recognise that one of those lines is a railway line, the other one's a road. I think one of the open spaces is a cemetery. They can start noticing little details. They might spot their own school on there or on their own house. That kind of thing is always fun. And they start noticing differences. So this one is quite clearly much more built up than the previous one. So you can see how using these aerial photographs, the children can really start to engage with the way that a local area has changed through relatively recent past. If you're using this with much younger children, we've used this with even reception year one. A really nice way of engaging them is to cut these shapes out. So the children literally have these shapes cut out in paper, and they try and match them on the photograph, so they can see which ones are on all the photographs, which ones appear on the older ones and not the newer ones, and the other way around. So it's just a different way of engaging young children with the same activity. If you want to access these straight away, If you go to a site called the Aerial Photo Explorer on the Historic England website, it covers the whole country, has a map of the whole country. I've zoomed in on Redruth here, and you can see each of those orange rectangles is an aerial photograph of the area. The red and purple dots are oblique photographs, which are taken at angles, or more modern colour photographs. But all of these you can zoom to a full screen size, and they're there to use straight away. Very recently, we've just put this site, which is called the Baseball and Bomber site, which is the US Air Force Second World War aerial reconnaissance photographs, which are really fascinating, particularly in Cornwall. And so you have many air bases which are photographed, which you can access through here. And in the same way, you can zoom out and use these in the classroom. There are all kinds of things you can spot. If you know where to look, you can spot actual planes flying in the sky, or American airmen playing baseball on their airfields, that kind of thing. But it's a really fascinating site. So once you've used aerial photographs, the next stage is to use historic maps. So this one is from 1902. It's of Redruth, and again, this comes from the Historic England archive. These are lots of fun to use with children. I wouldn't just put them in front of the children and say, look at this old map, isn't it interesting? What we always do with these is play the Where's Wally game. So this game, it goes down very well. I've used this with children from as young as year 1, which is right up to year 9s. The game is very simple. You ask the children to look at the map. They might be in pairs or in small groups. One child is Wally, and they hide somewhere on the map. And they choose somewhere on the map, and then their friends have to try and find them by asking questions that can only be answered yes or no. So they're trying to identify where in historic Redruth their friend is hiding. It's a fun game, but in terms of history, what's the reason I use this and the reason it works really well is that the children really engage with historic maps when they're playing this game, because, as you know, children are inherently very competitive. They will hide in the most obscure corners on the map, which means their friends have to look in the most obscure corners. And so the children will engage with the map. They'll notice things on this map that they would not have noticed to begin with. And it really gets them thinking about change and continuity. And more importantly, it gets the children, they start to naturally raise historical questions. They start asking questions about how things have changed. So that game works really well. There's some really nice extensions with older children. We ask them to decenter, to imagine themselves as Wally, to go into the map. What can you see? What can you smell? What can you hear? With some year 6 and 7 children, we said, you're Wally, you're in the map, you've got your mobile phone. Can you tweet your position? Can you describe where you are in 144 characters? That kind of thing. With younger children, it's necessary to scaffold it. So we sometimes give children compass roses so they can start using north, south, east and west, or we might give them question starters, or you might do some pre-learning on identifying what some of the things on the map are. But as I say, I've used this with children as young as 6-year-olds, but with appropriate scaffolding before. The next stage is to then make a comparison with a modern map. So this map that you can see is a modern map of Redruth. If I go back to the previous one, it will fit directly on top of this one. So the children can put the modern map on top, place their finger on that, roll it back and see something underneath. So this is a really nice tool for making direct comparisons between modern and historical places. With this one, the activity I find that's really powerful is the same different interesting activity. It's very straightforward. Just ask children to find, for example, 5 things that are the same in both maps, 5 things that are different from one map to the other. But then most importantly, 1 or 2 things that they think, oh, that's interesting. And this is where you don't want to direct the children too much. You just want them to naturally come up with anything at all they see on the map that interests them. So, for example, I've put, they might spot that there's a railway line on both maps, that there's Fore Street on both maps, that Victoria Park is on both maps. They might spot that on the older map there's a cathedral bootworks, there's a memorial, a memorial on the older map. Memorials on the new map. There's the primary school on the newer map. So they make those simple comparisons. And again, we're looking at change and continuity through time. And then for interesting, you never know what children are going to come up with. I've done this with teachers as well, and you always get very different interpretation because everyone looks at a map through their own prior experience and interests. So they, for example, they might spot something that says Old Shaft, or the site of the manor house, it says on the older map. The initials PW, that one comes up a lot. And so once you've got a set of interestings from your class, you might then say, well, what I then always say to the children is, can you turn your interesting into a question? And so this is where the children are generating historical questions. So they might say, what is an old shaft? Or what has happened to the old shaft? Or what is in where the old shaft was, what's there now? Or what was the manor house? Who lived in the manor house? And what does PW stand for? And you might, with your class, you might get a set of, say, about 15 questions. And my next question to the class is always, how are you going to find the answer to these questions? And some bright spark will always say, Google it. And I always say, that's absolutely fine. But using the internet, historians do use the internet. So using Google is a perfectly valid way of trying to find some answers. Other things they might say, look in a book. They might say, go to a museum. They might say, ask somebody, ask an expert, ask someone who maybe works at your school, who lives locally. And then hopefully one very bright spark in your class will say, we could go and have a look, because that is the golden answer, is to go and investigate. So as a teacher, what you really want to do then is, can you create a walk with your children from the school that will take in some of these interesting places they've come across? And you've generated these questions. You could go on a walk. You may not be able to answer any of them. You may be able to answer one or two, but just by going to have a look, you might discover something in the landscape that helps you interpret these. So this approach is, you need to be brave as a teacher, because as a teacher, it's tempting to think you're teaching local history. You need to learn the knowledge yourself and then impart it to the children. But doing it this way around, it's coming from the children. They're generating their own lines of inquiry, and you as the teacher are supporting them in discovering the answers. And it's also perfectly okay to not get the answer sometimes. That is all part of being an historian. You can access the historic maps from the Cornwall Council website, which not all areas of the country have this particular resource, so it's definitely worth using and taking advantage of in Cornwall. In addition, you could also use the National Libraries of Scotland website, which has what's called the map side-by-side viewer, which, and again, you can pick anywhere in England. I've chosen Redruth again, where you can, as it says, have side-by-side a historic map on one side, modern either satellite image or modern map on the other, to make direct comparisons. So you can access both of these sites for free. These are just some examples of when schools have done this approach. This is a school in Gloucestershire. You can see they did the same, different, interesting, some of the ideas that children came up with. This is another way of accessing maps. This is a school in Yorkshire where they were more formally looking for certain features in historic maps and modern maps and making comparisons between the two. This is one I did with a school in Somerset with quite young children. So this was some pre-learning really before they did the Where's Wally game. They were just identifying parts of a map first and understanding what they represented before they then went into the game. So you can see, and again, it's difficult to separate the history and the geography when you're doing map works. And this is a similar idea that we were talking about with the aerial photographs. You can do the same thing with historic maps, identifying shapes, matching shapes in later maps. So this child here in Bristol is looking at field shapes, and then later was spotting how the field shapes influence street shapes in the city as the city grew. These are some nice examples in the Midlands of using aerial photographs more formally, recording what can be spotted. This one is quite a nice idea where children were looking at an aerial photograph and then turning that into a map, which again, lots of geography there, but also elements of history too. And this is just a nice example of a heritage trail that resulted from that approach, with the children having generated the questions, gone for a walk locally, and then recorded that formally with photographs as a trail. This is a very nice example we saw recently in a school where old and new photographs were concertinaed, and so that from one angle you can see the old photograph, and the other angle the modern photograph. So as teachers, you will come up with lots of creative ways of using these kinds of ideas that we've talked about. So you've decided you can take the children for a walk. It's nice to give the children a little bit of prior knowledge, just to get them thinking about what they might look out for. So depending on where you are, you might give them a little bit of architectural historical knowledge. So understanding that single bay houses are going to be more likely to be earlier than double bay houses is remarkably helpful. It just helps you understand when roads were built in an area, which were the older roads, which were the newer roads. I've used this particular sheet with children as young as 6 years old, and they weren't identifying the exact buildings, but they were identifying features of buildings which they spotted on buildings locally. And again, what this does is it supports children's chronological understanding. Can they understand which buildings are older, which are newer? What are the features of the buildings that will tell them that? Just simple things like chimney pots, sash windows, arches over doorways, just little features like that help put things into an historical context. You may feel that your school is in the middle of a modern housing estate, and you might think there's no local history here. That's not true. Local history can be from prehistory right up to modern day, 20th century. This is an example of a school in Swindon where when we looked at historic maps, all we found were fields. There wasn't even an old farmhouse. But what we did there was focus on the housing estate itself and discovered the fascinating history of why the housing estate was built, where the people who lived there, first of all, were living before, what the kinds of jobs they did, what was special about the houses, how those houses differed from houses previously. And it's simple things like having gardens, central heating, indoor toilets, stuff that children would take for granted now that in, say, the 1950s wouldn't necessarily be the case. So a modern housing estate is local history as well, and the story of them. My personal favourites are post boxes in terms of supporting with local history. So, for example, this one here, you might be able to see it has an E, an R, and a V and a 1 on it. That is the initials of the reigning monarchs. So that's ER as Edward Rex, V11 7th. So this post box was put there during the reign of Edward VII, 1901 to 1910. And the reason that's helpful is that it tells you that the houses nearby would have been built around about the same time. So if you're not sure when the houses near your school were built, go and find your local post box. It might be a VR one, like this one, which means it's built in Victorian times. This one is GR George V, which is 1910 to 1936. This one, very special, ERV111, Edward VIII, who was only king for 6 months. If you find an Edward VIII postbox, they're very rare, so count yourself very lucky. Postboxes tell all kinds of stories. This particular one in Bristol was once set on fire by suffragettes. This one, someone sent this to me when they went on holiday. This is actually in Mumbai. This one is actually in Barbados. So postboxes can tell you a little bit about empire as well. So I've used them with schools where the children have written their local history through the eyes of the postbox. So one school in Bristol is an area that was bombed a lot in the Second World War, and then the Victorian houses were cleared and new flats were built in the 1950s and 60s. So the oldest remaining building is the postbox, and the children tell the story of the area through the eyes of the postbox. It's seen the Luftwaffe flying over, it's seen it's seen the bombs dropping, it's seen the bulldozers knocking the houses down. And one child said it's seen the mums and dads posting letters to their children who were evacuated, that kind of thing. So using an inanimate object to tell local histories is a really powerful way of engaging children. Another example of that is this particular book, What Did the Trees See?, which is the same idea, telling the story of a village through the eyes of the tree that's been there the whole time. A school in Beer Alston, just over the border in South Devon, did this exact approach because they had a huge tree just outside their school. So the children have investigated maps, they've looked at photographs, they've been on a walk, they've raised questions. The next stage is who lived here? Can we bring these places to life? And this is what really engages the children. So the first way of doing this is using a street directory. Now, street directories are available online, It's a bit of a fiddle to find your local area, but again, anywhere in the country is covered. So if you go to the website, you'll find Cornwall, and you'll be able to find your locality. You'll be able to download something that looks like this. Not particularly exciting to look at. It's a list of residents and a list of professions in the local area. So again, I've used the example of Redruth. With children, the fun bit of it is looking and identifying occupations that they would and wouldn't recognise. Again, I would start with what's familiar, what do they recognise first of all. So we got things like builders, we got a farmer, they'll know what a farmer is. They'll know what, they might know what a blacksmith is. You never know, it's worth asking them. Then there's other interesting stories in here. In this one in Redruth, there's a public vaccinator, which a few years ago may not have been of much interest, but suddenly becomes much more relevant now. There is, in this one, this was what was particularly interesting because it was something I'd never come across in a street directory in another part of the country, and that is this person who is an emigration agent. And of course that speaks to the story in Redruth of the mining industry going into decline, and the miners in Cornwall then going to find work overseas. It might be South America, South Africa, South Australia, where there are communities from Cornwall, and so an emigration agent would have aided those people in moving elsewhere. So there's always interesting little stories you can discover in a street directory of occupations and things that people did. You can even combine it with maths, make a Venn diagram, modern jobs, Victorian jobs, which ones do we have now, which ones are there that in Victorian times that the children don't recognise, and what jobs do people do today that they didn't have in Victorian times. And so once having used the street directory, the next stage is to use historical censuses. Now this is different because to access a census, the sites that allow you to do this are subscription sites. They can be accessed for free through public libraries and through your local archives. And if you've got the time, they're incredibly rewarding. Again, if it's something you're struggling with or don't have the time to do, Heritage Schools Programme can come support you with this. But they are really powerful to use. So if you've ever seen a house through time, or Who Do You Think You Are, you'll be familiar with what a census return looks like. This is the website one of the websites that you might use. So eventually you will find you can get an image like this is of a census return. Now, just to be clear, a census, they were taken every year from 1801 with a 1 at the end, right up to 2021. If they're over 100 years old, then we as historians can access them and use the information on them. If they're less than 100 years old, then there's information there that's still private of people who are still alive. So we can go right up to the 1921 census. I prefer to use the 1901, 1891 censuses because you get a few different households per page. By 1911, people were filling in their own census returns. So you have to think of them as a snapshot in time. This is one moment in time where someone has knocked on a door and a enumerator's knocked on a door, asked questions of people living there, like name the people living in this house, how old are they, what are their jobs, where were they born, and it gives us all this information, which is fascinating to use with children. And again, I've used these with children as young as 6, and you might think the children won't be able to engage with this, but children at that age are used to reading each other's handwriting in school, which is a lot worse than the handwriting on these censuses. So no child will be able to read everything on the census, but every child will be able to find something, and usually it's a name they'll spot and they'll recognise. With older children, I like to get them to, I present with a hypothesis that they will then investigate. So, for example, this is a place called Little Vauxhall in Redruth. So the residents of Little Vauxhall in 1901 would have worked in the mining industry, was my hypothesis. Or the residents of Little Vauxhall in 1901 would have been born in Redruth. Now, I would give them several pages of the census, and they would use the information to either prove or disprove my hypothesis. And as they do this, they start to discover all kinds of things. So they might just look at where the children were born, where the residents were born, or they might just look at their occupations, but they'll start spotting other things like makeup of the families, sizes of the families, You may even notice the final column has a list of what we would say were disabilities, and with language that we wouldn't use in the 21st century, like imbecile, idiot. But you need to talk through this with the children about how language has changed through time. The children sometimes might just be interested in looking at the different names they can find. Can they find their own name, their friends' names? Where were people moving from? Why were people moving? How were they moving? So we've done this in Swindon, and children have realised that people were coming from all around the country travelling on the railways. Or if a small school in Somerset, everyone was born in the same village. And you never know what little story you might discover. I did this in Bath, and we spotted one of the servants living in one of the grand houses was born in Barbados, and we didn't know, was she white, was she black? It raised questions and stories that you can investigate. You might even recognise surnames of children from your school, families that have been in an area for a very long time. So there's masses you can discover using census returns. I've just put this one. This is just a really nice example. This is one is actually my wife's great aunt, and this is one in 1911 where you filled in your own census. And in the disability, it says infirmity section. She's written for herself and her two unmarried daughters that they are unenfranchised, or we might say disenfranchised, essentially meaning they don't have the vote. So this is an example of a spoils census by suffragettes in 1911. So there you might just be able to make out it where it says that. So they can tell you all kinds of things. This is one in Bath, the same thing, which is a woman who rented out a room for a night for women to go in, so they wouldn't have to fill out the census. It says no vote, no census. Some examples just to show this is, you can see this is a year 2 child using a census. They were looking for a very specific name of someone they knew who'd gone to their school. So they weren't doing the hypothesis activity, but they're engaging with the census in a very different way. Another example is this: it's through the keyhole, where you could ask the children to imagine they're looking through the keyhole of a property, and they produce a piece of writing describing who and what they can see inside a house, having used the census as the resource to give them the information. A more formal way of doing it is to record all the people and all the occupations on a single street. You could perhaps then map that with where those people were working, if they're working in factories or maybe working in the docks, you could map their walks to work, that kind of thing. This is a lovely idea done on an art trail in Bristol, where the children created little blue plaques for all the people that they found on the census in their street, because in most towns we'll have a little blue plaques trail, but just using them on paper plates works really nicely. This is an example of one we used in Somerset, where the children uploaded it onto a website, which was GPS triggered, so that the parents could then walk around the village and find information the children had discovered through their phone. And this is a nice example in North Somerset, where a teacher who really gone to town on this and took the children to the local churchyard, did rubbings of gravestones, discovered where these people lived, found them on the old maps, found them on the censuses. So it's entirely up to you how you might go with this kind of idea. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something we've done a lot of work with schools with, which is looking at local war memorials and how you can use those to support work you might be doing on remembrance. Often this is done around November time, but it can be done at any time of the year. So most villages will have a war memorial. There are some thankful villages that don't have them because no one in the village died during the First World War. But these are very powerful to use with children, because it's relatively straightforward for children themselves to do the research on the names on a war memorial and discover where these men, because it will be men, lived and where they died. And that can lead to bigger questions about the First World War, about how it started, where it took place, what was the impact on the local area. The website we use is the Commonwealth War Graves website, which is very straightforward to use. I've created how-to guides for schools on how to use this. So again, that's something we can supply schools with. You might feel uncomfortable about the idea of children doing rubbings of gravestones, particularly of more recent ones, but many churchyards have these Commonwealth War Grave stones. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission actively encourage children to do this. They want children to engage with these stories, so doing rubbings of these stones and then using the website to discover about who these men were and where they lived locally. It's a very powerful thing that you can do. This particular website is called A Street Near You, and it is aiming to populate the map with all the men who died in the First World War. So it is a fantastic resource that you can use. This is just examples of censuses from 1911 of men on that was on the Red Roof War Memorial. So you discover the name, you can find a census, discover the house that they lived in. And this is a nice example in Bristol of having done that, and also, if you're very lucky, finding images of the men on the site, who are on the memorial, and using those as part of a display. This is another Historic England resource. This is the Aerial Archaeology Explorer. From this particular site will show you places near your school that are on the National Archaeological Register, and so you can discover prehistoric sites, but also right up to 20th century sites that have been excavated or identified near your school. And you'll be surprised what you might discover. It might be something as recent as the Second World War. It might be something as ancient as the Stone Age. But it can raise questions and get you interested in a particular area of your local history. Historic England Education, we have a big prehistory timeline and prehistory resources that are free for schools to use. So if you're doing some prehistory and you're struggling for ideas locally, please use the Historic England website. The other, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, Historic England, we have the register of listed buildings nationally. I think the statistic is that 95% of the population live within a 5-minute walk of a listed building. There will be something near you that's listed. It's likely to be a house or an old building, but it could be something as unusual as a roller coaster, a zebra crossing, if you happen to live in Abbey Road in London. It could be anything, really. Public toilets, some of those in Bristol. This is a building in Red Roof, and this is just an example of one way of engaging with listed buildings, which is, we call it the zones of inference, where you ask the children to record what they know about a place already, what they can infer. So you might say to the children, what do you think it is? Then again, it's the raising questions. What do I want to know? How do I find out? If you go onto the Historic England website, you'll discover maybe a rather dry piece of architectural history about the place. We're really keen, and this is just an example of listed buildings in Red Roof. We're really keen for schools to engage with what we call the Missing Pieces project, which is children uploading their own information about listed buildings onto the Historic England website. What makes those buildings special? We'd love to see models, pictures, drawings, writing about those buildings, about what makes those special. We call that the Missing Pieces, because that's how we can really engage people with locally listed buildings. I've just put a couple of examples here of other ways of engaging children with a local area, which is using actors in role. So we've taken children for walks where they've met, they're not famous people, but just people who are real, who we discovered on street directories or censuses, who lived in buildings, and they're telling their story of what the jobs they did or the way they lived. And if you don't use actors, you might use someone who works in your school, or we've done it with older children, year sixes, taking year ones on heritage trails, that kind of thing. But it's just different ways of engaging children with things locally. And to finish off, I just want to let you know about the Heritage Schools Award. So we're really keen for schools to engage with this, and we will present this award. And the way you can access this is you can upload onto our website examples of planning, children's work, visits and things that you've done relating to local history. We're trying to make sure it's not that onerous to do, that it's, you don't have to present huge amounts of evidence, but just enough to show that it's something that your school is actively engaged in. The key criteria being that you're delivering heritage projects, you're engaging with local heritage partners, that you're supporting your staff with knowledge with CPD. So and if you're interested in doing this kind of thing, I'm very happy for you to contact me, and I can help you on that process. And we're also always producing resources at heritage schools to support schools with their local heritage planning. So again, if you want to download some resources, feel free. And these are all free for schools to use. You can access them from our website. Just to finish, so I'm very happy for any school in Cornwall. If you would like more information about heritage schools, you're very welcome to contact me. There's my email address. As I say, the Heritage Schools programme is entirely free for schools to use, and we're keen to work with as many schools in Cornwall as possible. Learning about local history is so important for children. Our original aim with the Heritage Schools programme was about giving children a sense of pride in their area, and this is what we're finding, that it does that. Children become proud in what's special about their area, but also it really engages them with their story and engages them with history in general. So by looking at their local history, it really helps them understand and engage with national history and global history. I mean, that specific example of Cornwall is if you're starting with the local mining industry, you're then understanding what they were mining, why they were mining it, how that was being used across the country. But then it takes that onto that much bigger story about the Cornish miners working right across the world and why that was important. But I think starting with that local really helps engage the children and taking those children out to see real things that what's really rewarding is when you take them to somewhere that they've seen 100 times before and walked past 100 times before, and then they look at it with fresh eyes, and you get children saying lovely things about it, they will literally say, "Oh, that's our whatever it is building," or we made a lovely film where one child spontaneously said, "Oh, we're holding the heritage in our hands," which I think is just the most fabulous quote. But it really is. We find it really motivates the children in terms of their love for history. Obviously, in Key Stage 2, all schools are looking at prehistory at some point, and it's a huge area of history. Stone Age to Iron Age, over 1 million years of history, and it can be quite an abstract thing to teach children about. So, what we try and support you with is finding out where your local prehistoric sites are, so you can use the Historic Environment Record for that. We have lots of resources that you can download for free from the Historic England Education site, including not just sort of factual stuff on prehistory, but also about how you engage children with archaeology, and that can be really useful in the classroom. So helping children understand how we know about prehistory. So just simple activities you can do in the classroom relating to archaeology is really powerful. And if you can find a prehistoric site within walking distance of your school, which in Cornwall, it's quite likely, just taking children, even if it's just seeing lumps and bumps in the ground, is really powerful, because there might not be a lot of interpretation there, but just if you take for a walk, if you're only there for 10 minutes, just having a look and just beginning to get the children's understanding and imaginations going about what that place might have been is very powerful.
Hello, my name's Ian Rowe, and I'm the Activities Officer for the Monumental Improvement Project, and I'm just going to give you some additional information about the mapping system that Michael showed you earlier. This is the Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Historic Environment Mapping System, which is available online, and there's a PDF which you can download to use with the links on, which I'll be going through in this presentation. The first slide you can see on the screen here now is the basic search screen. So you can type in your location, and from that location you can pick your address is down through, and then click on the find, and it will take you through to that actually location on the map. Moving on to the next slide, this map shows you the actual locations of the sites and monument point records. Every single dot you can see here on the screen is actually a site in the landscape which has been recorded in the Historic Environment Record, and by clicking onto them you can find out more information from it. The information relating to the date of the site is shown in the left-hand side menu. Once you've delved down into the dots on the previous screen, you can now find out more information, and you can change the background image. The original image was an Ordnance Survey base map. This one here has got aerial photographs on it, and also I've overlaid that with lines from photographic aerial reconnaissance, so there's more detail than there are in the dots. Again, you can click into areas and find out more information from this. This next slide, I've actually underlaid the mapping with the tithe map. The tithe maps were produced in the 1840s, late 1830s, 1840s, and they were really to document land ownership. So these are, in most cases, the earliest maps you'll find for many locations. You can see it's split on the screen. On the right-hand side is the tithe map for Lincolnhorn parish, and on the right-hand side is St Cleer, which is not shown up. It's got the basic mapping on, and you can zoom between these two layers and actually overlay them, which I'll show you in the next stage. The red areas on the screen, the hatched areas, are actual scheduled monuments. So again, like before, you can click through into these hatched areas and find out more information about the scheduled monuments. This next slide, I've changed the mapping underneath again for the 1880 OS map. And there are several other maps that you can play around with for backgrounds as well, and overlaid this with information about the designated landscapes, the area of outstanding natural beauties, and also the Mining World Heritage Site is shown on this slide. On the next slide, I've underlaid the mapping with the 1908 OS map, and over the top of that I've actually shown a mapping layer which shows mining sites. So it shows mine sites, mine shafts, and the position of engine houses. And again, if you click into the dots on these, it will take you through to more information about those sites. This next slide takes things on a bit further into, it's called the polygon level, and it's a bit more information than the dots which are shown on the earlier slide. And as you can see from this nice example from Falmouth, is that the layers of history are basically all layered together on one map. Moving on, you can also find out about listed buildings, and on this map here you can see that the listed buildings are actually identified, and the key is on the left hand side again. Linking through into these polygons will take you through to more information about those sites. So this next slide is an evolution really of one of the early ones I showed you. Instead of having dots on the screen, we've now got polygons, and the polygons are interlinked historic sites. So by clicking anywhere on the polygon, it'll take you information to that site. And finishing off with the historic environment mapping, we've got a fantastic opportunity to overlay and fade through areas and mapping. This one here, I've got an aerial photograph of Falmouth and also a historic map laid underneath with the bar you can see on the left hand side in the menu allows you to fade in and out between the two different layers. Have a play around, it's loads of fun. The mapping slides that you've just seen are all related to the historic environment record, and this is an evolving record, and possibly there's 80,000, well there are definitely 80,000 sites on there, but there's probably about another 40,000 sites in Cornwall which are not actually on the historic environment record. And using the links on this screen, you can go to the different sites to make additions or changes to any of the sites which are on there, but also you can add your own, and just click on the links below to find out more. And then moving as far away from Cornwall as you can possibly get, the National Library of Scotland have got some amazing mapping that you can use as well. Taking the theme really from the last slide I showed, you can fade in and out of maps, and this one here actually shows you back at Minions again, where we're looking at LiDAR being used on the screen, as well as the 1880 maps as well, and you can slide the bar backwards and forwards to reveal areas on the map. And finally, you can replace the LiDAR with any other map you want as well. Again, the slider still works. This is an aerial photograph of the area. I hope that was informative for you. Please have a look at the PDF, download it and have a click through. Any queries at all you've got, please contact the Historic Environment Record. Thank you for listening.